Thank you so much for choosing to come to the Confronting Classroom Disruption and Teacher Burnout breakout session. My name is Greuel. I'm Associate Counsel here at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. We're going to start with a brief video, which I'll explain in a second, go over some of the law on this, and then I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful panelists, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But if you have any questions, please save them until the end of the presentation. We'll leave a few minutes at the end for questions. Schools are facing a growing problem across the country as it pertains to teacher burnout. And school leadership, like you in this room, are often the ones that are dealing with that fallout. To really frame how big of an issue this is, we're going to start with a short documentary. This is the premiere, so you guys are the first to see it. For the last few months, Will has been interviewing teachers from across the Midwest who feel that student behavior has grown out of control, that they don't have administrative support, and that the learning environment is compromised and at times unsafe. But don't just take my word for it. You can listen to these teachers. So what can you, as school leaders, do about this problem? First, I'm going to go over what the law is in Wisconsin and federal law as it pertains to student behavior, classroom management, and teacher authority. That will serve as a background for the stuff that you guys really want from this session, which is practical steps that school leaders can take to strengthen classroom environments, including addressing discipline challenges, ensuring consistent administrative support, and getting the focus back on learning, because that's what's really important. To discuss, we have two wonderful and experienced educators with us here today who have lived these issues out during their career. Daniel Buck, who you may remember if you attended the teacher speech session with Rick Essenberg earlier today, is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, director of the Conservative Education Reform Network, and affiliate of AEI's James Quinton Wilson program in K-12 education studies. Before joining AEI, Mr. Buck was a senior fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and assistant principal at Lake Country Classical Academy and a classroom teacher at Hope Christian Schools, Holy Spirit Middle School, and Green Bay Area Public Schools. Rhyen Staley is the Director of Research for Defending Education. He is also a third-generation educator with 15 years' experience as a public and private school teacher. Staley spent over 25 years coaching male and female athletes in middle, high school, and at the college level. But most importantly, he is married to an educator and is the father of two school-aged children. I know after hearing those bios, you want to get into hearing from those guys, so I promise I'll get through this relatively quickly. But just as a reminder, we are recording these sessions, so all the information that will be included on the subsequent slides as it pertains to the law, you'll have access to. So if I go a little bit quickly, you can go back and review it at another time. So there are two major requirements in Wisconsin as it pertains to classroom management and student behavior and teacher authority. First and foremost, you need to know that school boards have the authority to make rules pertaining to the conduct of students in order to maintain good decorum and a favorable academic atmosphere. You guys do. You have the power to make these positive changes and to make change based on what we saw in that documentary. So school boards are also required to adopt a code of conduct. So this code of conduct is something most school boards have in place. You probably already know what your code of conduct is, but I think it's kind of important to go over if you want to make any changes to your school code of conduct, or it's out of date, or you somehow don't have one. The Wisconsin statute actually requires that you convene a committee of district residents to come up with the school classroom code of conduct. So that means you guys are getting input in your community about what's appropriate for students in your classroom, which can be really, really helpful. The code of conduct itself also has some requirements of what needs to be included. Specifically, you need to define what constitutes dangerous, disruptive, or unruly behavior, or behavior that intervenes with the ability of teachers to teach effectively. Grounds for removing a student from class, procedures for determining educational placements from students, and a procedure for notifying parents of removed students. You should review your district's code of conduct. Does it meet all of these requirements? These are questions you should be asking. Like I mentioned, the other major requirement in Wisconsin law for schools has to do with teacher authority. Wisconsin school boards are required to adopt a policy that allows teachers to use necessary and reasonable force to do the things that you see on your screen here: quell a disturbance, protect property, obtain possession of a weapon or dangerous object within a student's control, protect the safety of others. I'm not going to read them all, but this is a policy that you are required to have. Do you know what your policy says? Does it meet all these requirements? These are important questions that you need to ask. So, last slide on teacher authority here, but I think it's really important to highlight there is a statutory authority in Wisconsin for teachers to remove disruptive students. This is baked into our Wisconsin statutes. But teachers in Wisconsin don't feel that this is something they can actually do. Or even if they do remove a student is almost immediately sent back to class in a lot of cases. They don't...
With a bag of Takis or a sucker.
Yes, and I'm sure these guys will get well into that today. But these are issues, right? So again, what is your policy on this? How do administrators handle it? These are things we'll get into. The practical implications of this we'll get into in just a second. I'm not going to get into these statutes in detail today, although they're interesting, but I did want to flag them for you as we're talking about student behavior, just so that you know that they're there. There are specifications about what is required or allowed for suspensions, expulsions, and then seclusion and restraint. That means putting a student somewhere away from other students or restraining them in some circumstances. So again, these are just statutes to know. If you have questions on them, you can reach out to us personally. But then we also have federal law, and this is something that everybody needs to keep in mind as well. So federal law offers a broad discretion to local school boards to make decisions as it pertains to classroom management and teacher authority, among other things. On the screen here, you'll see a couple different examples, but my favorite quote comes from that last one, Tinker versus Des Moines. It says, "We have long emphasized the need for affirming the comprehensive authority of the state and local officials consistent with the fundamental constitutional safeguards to prescribe and control conduct in schools." That's the United States Supreme Court. So this is really baked into the foundation, not only in Wisconsin, but federally as well. So the sentiment is enforced again and again in federal law. Teachers, principals, and other school officials are allowed to take reasonable action to maintain order, discipline, and appropriate educational environments. And this is also the case to this effect. Teachers cannot be held liable for harm caused by any act or omission if the actions were carried out in conformity with state, federal, and local laws in furtherance of an effort to maintain control. Again, there seems to be really good provisions in state and federal law, but teachers aren't feeling it. So it really comes down to administration in a lot of ways. I do have to mention that there are some limits on this authority under federal law as well. For example, students with disabilities, there's limits on when the conduct is in violation of school policy, but it's determined to be a manifestation of the child's disability. There can be limits on what can be done there. Schools may also not discriminate in the use of discipline authority. And finally, as you guys are considering possible solutions, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit, you can't disseminate certain student information without the parent's permission, which is probably something you've heard about in the past as well. So one thing I do want to flag as well, there have been efforts to really strengthen the law in Wisconsin as it pertains to teacher authority. So as we know, under the law, teachers are allowed to remove students from their classroom. But as you heard, that authority is often greatly discouraged or undermined. So AB 614 is a law that was introduced that would have done a couple different things. It passed the Wisconsin Assembly and the Wisconsin Senate, but was ultimately vetoed by Governor Evers on March 27th of this year. I know, citing funding, which was an interesting one, and lack of adequate mental health and special needs supports. There was actually an amendment added to the bill that specifically addressed special needs. So again, just the veto message was a little strange. And this is not a political issue. This is an across-the-board problem, right? So it was disappointing to see that. But I do want to mention some of the solutions that the bill offered, because even though this isn't the law in Wisconsin, these are things you can consider when trying to address this problem. So a lot of words. I know, I'm sorry, but AB 614 would have strengthened the authority of teachers, especially when it comes to removing students from the classroom, by disallowing persistently disruptive students or violent students from immediately being returned to class without a behavior intervention plan to really get to the root of the problem. It also would have prohibited school boards or other school authorities, administration from terminating teachers for removing a student, enforcing rules, reporting unsafe conditions, requesting assistance, or taking action to protect the safety of the teacher or others. And Wisconsin statute requires that parents are notified of a removal of students, of a removal of a student, but not notification to parents of all the other students whose learning was disrupted. And a lot of parents who don't have disruptive students themselves don't even know this is a problem and how often it's happening in their own classrooms. And finally, Wisconsin statute requires schools, like I said, to adopt a code of conduct that defines certain things, but AB 614 would have gone a step further and required boards to adopt a policy on reasonable safety measures to address incidents that materially or substantially interrupt instruction or compromise safety, persistently disruptive students, or violent incidents. So again, just kind of taking it one step further to really ensure that teachers are getting the support that they need. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our two wonderful educators over there. And I'm going to start with a question just to get you guys started here. When teachers are talking about classroom disruption, that can mean a lot of things. What kinds of behaviors are actually driving teachers out of the profession? Or would you say that it has less to do with student behavior itself and more with how the administration handles these situations?
What makes it to the news is usually the egregious behaviors. There's, a brawl in the lunchroom with 30 students. A kid was sent to the ER. That's what makes it to the news. You talk to most teachers, though, what really gets under their skin are the small behaviors. The one that I mentioned in the video, where you tell a kid, sit in your assigned seat, and they look at you and go, no. And then they sit somewhere else. I think the reason that really gets under a teacher's skin is it's such an affront to their authority itself, right? If a kids are in the lunchroom and they break out into a fight, like that has nothing to do with me. But it's that insult's almost implicit in, no, I don't have to listen to you. That really gets under teacher's skin. The other thing is, I've worked in some really rough schools, but major fights were still every couple of weeks. But small disruptions are consistent, constant, and a fight might really blow up the school culture for the day. But again, that's once a month, once every other week. The small disruptions are constant. So if we're looking at the amount of interrupted learning, it's those little disruptions that really eat away at a school culture, that really eat away at student learning over time, because there's just so many of them, right? It's one big cut versus the death by 1,000 cuts. I don't know if you want to build off that at all.
Let me share some data, because Daniel and I talked before this, obviously prepping, and one of the things being a coach for 25 years, and in full disclosure, I had the privilege of working under Kelly Sheffield from UW many years ago. So he was a mentor for me at one point. I love data, and so pulled data, and funny enough, I pulled Wauwatosa's data for discipline. So if you're a school board member in here, I appreciate those boards that put on their board document sites actual data, but always you have to take data with a grain of salt, because one of the things we've seen is that because of past administrations putting pressure on schools over racial disparities, schools have gotten creative in hiding the data. So this data that I'm going to present to you real quickly, just know that it may be skewed and we don't really know what the true numbers are, but I want you, for Wauwatosa, there is roughly 6,700 students in the district. It is a K-12 district as far as I can tell, right? So if there's somebody in here from Tosa, please correct me. Black population is roughly 19%. That's an important number just for conversation's sake. There are 15 schools in the district. Okay, so those are a couple of key data points that I look at when I was looking at this stuff. Discipline data from 2024, 2025. I only picked that date because if you look at the 21-22 data, it is ugly. But that's also, remember, the first year kids were really back in school after the COVID fiasco. Here's the office referrals, not out-of-school suspensions, not expulsions, just office referrals. Total for the whole district, 1,791. Out of the black population, 990 of the referrals were to black students, so that's roughly 55% of all referrals in the district. Free and reduced lunch students, so this is based on income status, 64% of all office referrals went to those students. 24% of all students in the district are free and reduced lunch. Students, now this is really important here, so this is an important data point. Students with multiple events, so from 2 to 5 office referrals was about 302 students. By the way, the total referrals was just referral number, not student number. So take that into account. And then students with 6 or more referrals was 73. So what does that mean? At the lowest possible number I took, so if 302 kids got 2 office referrals and 73 kids got just 6 referrals, we're still talking about 1,038 office referrals went to just those 375 kids out of 6,700 kids in the district. So what we're talking about here is the majority of the referrals only went to about 5% of the students. Okay, and so why do I bring that data up? To come back to Daniel's point, we have this perception that there's all this chaos going on in schools, and it is. But I know Daniel can back this up too. As teachers in the schools, it was always the same 5 to 10 kids always in the office, always. And by the way, most of these office referrals are coming from 3 schools out of the entire district, the 2 high schools and the middle school. In fact, the middle school tended to be the worst. And so why do I bring that data up? Because I think one of the worst things for school discipline was actually Obama's Dear Colleague letter that set in stone, if you will, disparate impact. And it forced schools to start scrambling to adjust discipline specifically based on race. And that created the chaos where we're at now, which is restorative justice, which is SEL, which is all this stuff that's going on in our schools because they focus on race. Now go back to the numbers I gave you, and I'll give it back to Daniel here. The reason that I put free and reduced lunch is because statistically you're going to cover a lot of the minority students, sadly, and right, that's the point of education, right, to elevate those kids out of poverty. But we know that discipline issues is far more attached to income level, statistically, than it necessarily is to race. And so I want to bring up the fact that if TOSA were to just focus on income level when they looked at their discipline data, they would meet the needs of far more kids in that regard. And so, but what has happened with our discipline model is schools, because of Obama's disparate impact Dear Colleague letter, schools have shifted to really focusing on trying to get the 5% to stay in the classroom. I don't think, Daniel, we don't disagree. We don't disagree. But at some point, even state law says those kids who don't want to, who are disrupting the classroom, they got to go. But the current model for too many districts is those kids stay. And then you penalize the other 95% of the kids. And when the consequences don't have enough teeth, you're going to start to grow that percentage of misbehaviors. And you're going to start to have 10, 20, maybe even 30% of the kids who don't behave, because why? There's a risk benefit. And if you've raised kids, you know kids are kids.
I want to get to a point in your question that we didn't address on, is it the behavior or is it administration? Obviously, it's a little bit of both. But in my experience, and Patrick in the room, the man with the fine flow of hair and yellow tie right there, had this great report recently. It was called Teachers in Flight, was the title of the report, right? He's giving me a nod, yes, where they interviewed all sorts of teachers who quit and tried to figure out why that they were. So that survey kind of confirmed my own experience. When I had colleagues who quit, I think of one, I don't remember exactly what the student did, but caused a huge disruption in his class that day. He was frustrated, went to the administration and said, can you do something about this? They said no, and that's when he dropped his keys on his desk and walked out of the building, right? It wasn't the disruption. Teachers know that we're going to have to deal with some knuckleheads. Kids are going to be kids. To some extent, we almost enjoy it. I like a challenge. Come on, give me when I taught some classes that were too well behaved and it was a little bit boring. I was like, give me some challenge, give me something to work with. We can handle the behavior, but it's when we're not backed up by administration that we want to go. There's one school that I worked at, I knew I was going to leave. I confiscated a student's cell phone, as the policy was, brought it to the office, and they're not supposed to get it back until a parent comes and picks it up. I was in the hallway and I watched my principal take the phone middle of the day and give it back to the student. And that was the moment when I was like, I'm not coming back to this school. If they're not going to enforce their own policies and back me up and then come to me and say, why do those students have their phones? Why aren't you confiscating them? Why aren't you enforcing the policy? I was like, well, you guys aren't. So I think it ultimately does come back to administration.
So you guys heard me walk through what some of the law was in Wisconsin and federally. Where do you see the biggest gap between what schools can do and what they actually do as it pertains to classroom management and teacher authority?
All right, I'll lead off, and you'll have your thoughts formed by then. I think I've reviewed a lot of state policy. I've reviewed a lot of school level discipline policy. Usually they're pretty good. There's sometimes, there's a lot of you have to do X, Y, and Z before you can use a consequence, and I don't like that. You have to try all of these restorative practices. You have to do all of this PBIS. I don't necessarily oppose those ideas. When I was an assistant principal, if I was getting a kid in trouble, I would bring them in for lunch detention and have a conversation with them. What went wrong? What can you do better next time? How can we make this right? Right? I had those kinds of restorative conversations. I don't really like that word because it carries a lot of baggage now. I would reward kids and acknowledge them for what they did right. That's kind of PBIS. But you may have noticed there, I talked with them when they had a detention. Or an after-school detention, or an ISS, half-day ISS. That's when I would talk with them. It wasn't doing one before the other. It was always pairing them together. So if there's any policies in there where it says you have to do all of these proactive measures before you can give a consequence, I get rid of that. But generally, school discipline policies give administrators teeth. They can give detentions, they can give suspensions, expulsions. There's a lot of protections around that, and I understand why. We need to protect the rights of the students too. Where the breakdown comes is when that actually goes into action. When it's up to the assistant principal, the principal, the dean of students, whoever it is, to actually enforce those policies. Why does that breakdown happen? I think all of the incentives for administrators is towards leniency. When I was an assistant principal, there was constantly a pressure on me to be lenient. It's easier to sweep behavior under the rug. It's easier to just have a conversation with the kid and send them back to the room and say, let the teachers deal with it. If I was going to suspend a student or if I was going to give a consequence, anytime I put it into the system or sent that email, I knew my life was going to be a pain for the next week because of all the paperwork, all of the pushback, all of the proving that I did my homework and this is actually what happened, it was justified. All of the incentives on administrators are towards leniency. So the breakdown happens kind of at the tip of this sphere when it comes to the enforcement of those policies, not necessarily the policies themselves.
I think too many districts are they're hoping for change in how they administer their discipline policies. I'm going to give you something very actionable that's coming up very soon that's kind of related to what districts can do versus what they are doing. At Defending Ed, we've been tracking at defendinged.org. At our website, we have tons of resources, et cetera. One of the things we started doing in January was tracking all these student protests and student walkouts. I know there's been a handful, if not many, here in Wisconsin. And I've had the luxury of sitting through and reading as one of my source materials hundreds and hundreds of news articles. And so what I found fascinating in that study was reading the comments from students, reading the comments from schools and why they weren't disciplining or why they were doing what they were doing. And actually, I think we can catalog on maybe one hand the number of school districts in the press who actually discipline students with some level of, again, teeth to the discipline, to these students walking out. Now, what's really concerning about these student walkouts is that right down the road in Chicago, there was a special ed student who went missing, a 14-year-old who was part of this walkout and just kept going and so forth. Across the country, students have been allowed to leave campus unsupervised to march for political. And by the way, Daniel and I were just talking about this in the hallway with my colleague, Paul, that I don't care if it's something I support personally. I want to be as consistent as possible. And if students are breaking school rules, as long as they know that, as long as the parents know where they're at, then so be it. They have to suffer the consequences. But what I've read in the news articles and the responses from districts was their hands are tied. It's a free speech issue. Of course, they are always afraid, in my opinion, they're always afraid of the ACLU. They're afraid of the SPLC. They're afraid of these far left, big money organizations coming in and threatening lawsuits if they don't allow the students to, in this case, protest. But, as you mentioned, they have the authority under Tinker versus Des Moines to stop anything that is disruptive to the learning environment. I don't know about you, Daniel, but I've taught for a few years in the classroom, and there's nothing more disruptive to the learning environment than students just getting up and leaving the classroom or not even coming to class. I'm pretty sure that's the defining thing of disruptive. But this is something too, by the way. We've been collecting nonprofits and their influence, and the teachers' unions and their influence over these walkouts, despite what the SPLC says about me personally. Yes, I got a shout out by them. Yes, the teachers' unions are influencing. Yeah, man, I got a shout out, dog. The teachers' union are influencing these kids. Look at Chicago Teachers Union. Okay. One of the nonprofits produced a toolkit just recently that specifically states that their goal is to disrupt the learning environment so they can push their political agenda. And they're talking about K-12 students. So again, any school board members in here, because by the way, May Day is coming. That's May 1st. That's a socialist holiday that's coming up next Friday. And there's a national mobilization movement by the unions. They're a big part of this. These nonprofits who have clubs inside of your schools. The Sunrise Movement runs clubs inside of schools where they're training these students to organize these walkouts. Okay? You have the authority to say, no, you can't do this under Tinker. But you also need to have consequences in place. Because I get the feeling from being an outsider now, even though I do have kids in the schools, that saying, well, you have an unexcused absence from that class is not really doing it for these kids. What do they care? And so that's another problem. Now, there are places, and I've read this in a few places, where students felt very pressured to be part of these walkouts and were very perplexed because they were on that cusp of being expelled or suspended big time, because if they got one more class absence, that was it. But that's an extreme number of kids. So I say that to just give you something practical that's coming up on your radar.
A very important question I have for you both, kind of on this topic. Well, obviously on this topic, but what do you say to leaders who worry that stronger discipline policies will be seen as too harsh? Specifically in the context of there are things coming up. And if school leaders want to take the position that stronger discipline is the way to go, how do they advocate for that without coming across too harsh?
Yeah. Discipline, first and foremost, should be the least aggressive thing that stops the behavior. Right. My dad was a dean for 30-some years down in Joliet, which is a pretty tough neighborhood, and so so I learned that from him. That what do we need to do to stop the behaviors? It might be unexcused absence, right, and so forth. But what is it that needs to stop the behavior? Unfortunately, because going back to Obama's Dear Colleague letter and the push by far-left radicals with the idea that the schools are a school-to-prison pipeline, which is a fallacy, by the way, really effective. Schools have become afraid of this discipline that's too harsh. I'll agree that there are some cases where I don't even know what you do with some of these poor kids. I mean, their home environment and so on and so forth. But you know what percentage of the kids those are? About 5%, 4%, maybe even less than that, right? What we need to do is we need to find out how harsh of a discipline program keeps the 80 to 90% of the kids in the classroom focused on learning. And I mean, they're kids, right? So they're going to do little silly things. I mean, full disclosure, my son got a detention yesterday, and my wife and I both laughed because he was drawing pictures on the board that he shouldn't have. Okay. But so you could just, maybe I could be discredited now. I don't know. But kids do kids things, right? And they have consequences. They suffer the consequences. They move on. And so that's my position on this is I definitely don't support the corporal punishment stuff. I kind of agree with places that no, we're not doing that. Because I think there's so many other measures that we can take. The hardest part is, what do we do? As Fred Jones, a guy an older guy that was involved with school discipline stuff when I was coming through my program, I agreed with them. We want to keep these kids in school, but maybe this school is not the place for this kid. And that's the problem we're running into, is we're trying to keep certain kids that cannot thrive in a normal environment. Let's put them in the environments where they can thrive, and let's figure out what that is. So I'll turn it over to Dan.
Two things come to mind. The first one is kind of rhetorical shift. A worry about too strict of discipline, turning it around and putting a positive connotative spin on it. This idea that we've lost sight of tough love. I think we used to understand that tough love was a good thing. We've all seen children who have been raised without boundaries, without parental authority, without consequences given to them in the home, and they're not happy. They're out of control. Like the child is not stable. Like they're not a happy kid. But when children are brought up in homes with authoritative parents, not authoritarian, authoritative parents, when they have clear boundaries set around them, they're in control of themselves. They're happier. They can go play and not get hurt, they can make friends better. Like, this tough love is good for kids. Setting a high standard for kids is good for them. Expecting them to reach it, helping them when they don't, and giving them a pep talk when they fail, that's all good for them, right? Tough love is a good thing for kids. Authority, boundaries, order, these are not dirty words. These are good words for children. So there's kind of that rhetorical shift. And then I also think there's just some competence that needs to come along with it. I think our schools have been so afraid of discipline for so long that they don't really know how to do it well at this point. Shameless plug, TLO's Discipline Consulting, I can help. Was kind of some of the competence and execution of discipline. But when people hear discipline, if I'm having these arguments, everyone always jumps to you just want to expel kids and bring back corporal punishment. It's like, whoa, I didn't say that. That's not what I'm advocating for. If anything, discipline, as you said, you want to have the smallest intervention that curbs the behavior. So little shifts. I've watched many teachers who they say you're given 1 or 2 or 3 warnings, and then comes the consequence. Or they try to have patience and then finally blow up and say the whole class doesn't get recess for the rest of the day. Well, what's the incentive built in there? Ryan's now a student again. He's a 12-year-old boy. He thinks, I want to talk to my friend. Well, I know the first time I'm not going to get in trouble, so what am I going to do? Talk to my friend. And the second time I'm not going to get in trouble, so what am I going to do? Talk to my friend. Third time, she said I get 3 warnings, but often doesn't actually give a consequence on the 3rd warning, so what am I going to do? Talk again. Right? The incentive is always to go for it. But if instead I say, Ryan, stop talking, that's 1 minute out of recess. And then next time, Ryan, I already gave you a warning, that's 3 minutes from recess now. All of a sudden, his incentive is always to not make that whisper, to always ask, is it worth it? So even little shifts like that, giving small, consistent consequences, is going to curb a lot of that behavior, and you're going to end up with far fewer suspensions and expulsions because you're sweating the small stuff. Right? I've got bigger fish to fry. It's like you got big fish to fry because you're not dealing with the little ones. Yeah.
If I may. Real quick, going back to the protest thing, I'll give you an example of what's happening. Some of these schools have been so permissive with just letting these kids leave and walk out that school district in Canton, Michigan, I think it's Canton, Plymouth, they've had 3 student walkouts just since mid-January alone, and they've got more coming. And so what does that tell me? It tells me that the school is starting to lose control over these kids, and they're going to start to protest, not just, let's say, anti-immigration or whatever. They're going to start to protest over anything they don't like. And the school, to his point about the classroom angle, this is the administrative angle. The administrative angle is at some point that school is going to have to really drop the hammer hard. And then it's kind of not fair to the kids in some regard. They make choices, but it's not fair to the kids because you just allowed them for months to do these walkouts, whether you agree with them or not. I know we're running short on time here.
No, we're good. We have until 4:15, but we do want to leave some time for Q&A. So I'm going to ask you guys one more question, and then we'll open it up from questions for the audience. How can school leaders make clear, both in policy and practice, that teachers will be backed up?
I mean, it's through enforcing the policy. I feel like that's too simple of an answer, but so many times I've seen the policy not enforced. It's there, it's great, it's wonderful, it's beautiful. And then a parent complains about it, and then the teacher's brought into a meeting with the administrator, and, well, no, we're not going to enforce the policy anymore because it made a parent upset. Especially as... if you set the policy, you have to enforce it. So that's where I think that I'm going to end it there and hand it to you.
I'll give you an example, and I guess we'll finish this segment on that. My last teaching job before joining Defending Ed, I was working at an urban middle school in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I had started there. So I was bookending my teaching career. I started off in Joliet at the elementary level. So again, low income, very urban kids. I knew those kids, loved working with their families, and it was night and day from starting. My first principal, and Dr. Katie Brumley said this earlier about how teachers follow their principals, right? That's very true, because the reason I went from that first public school to a Catholic school is because my principal was about ready to retire. She was fantastic, old guard. Then I go to this school in Chattanooga, and it was kind of like a pseudo-magnet charter school type of thing, part of the district, and they were running restorative justice with fidelity. They were committed to it. They brought in a school counselor. So here's what I'm getting to with the administrative stuff, is that what I watched erupt in that school while I was teaching there, middle school again, all urban kids, is that the administration gave all discipline power to the school counselor, who came in, God bless him, he came in from juvie. He was working with the juvie kids. An entirely 10 kids intensive versus 300 kids. And you're trying to bring in a discipline program. And what it got to in that building was teachers crying out for enforcement of the rules they had in place, because what they were trying to do was basically counsel these kids into hope for change. They were trying to get them, and so what would happen is the counselor would, if a kid misbehaved, they'd go see the counselor. Or I've never worked in a building where kids were allowed to just leave the classroom and slam classroom doors with no consequences, and so on and so forth. And so my point to that is that there were rules in place. But then the administration, to their chagrin, to my chagrin, they gave that power up to the school counselor. And then by the time I go to leave, there was a war erupting between the school counselor and the assistant principal, who wanted to start actually enforcing the rules in place. And it got really ugly. And it got to the point, too, by the way, that in our teacher group chat, there were warnings constantly. 8th grade teachers go, I think there's something up today. I think there might be a fight today. I think there might be. And then, sure enough, at the end of the day, fight breaks out. And I know Daniel's pet peeve is the cell phone thing. This is one reason why cell phones need to come out of school, because I had an 8th grade student from my homeroom who spent the entire day fomenting that specific fight between two females so that he could film it and post it on Instagram. And then he got suspended, by the way. He got held accountable. But he didn't care, because you know why? He got 1,000 likes, 1,000 retweets, and 500 new followers. So when the social media aspect of these things, they cause issues as well. So I tangent a little bit. It's like you gotta have that meme from Sunny in Philadelphia, like the.
No, you're cooking. Keep cooking.
So I guess let's resume, and then we'll go to questions. We have the administrators, school board members, teachers. There has to be this concert, and everybody's on one page. Everybody's on one page, whether you agree with it or not. When my dad, I'll finish with this last piece, it's kind of funny. When my dad was the dean of Joliet Township, he was also the head of all discipline in the entire district, their entire program. And it's one of those things where it was really funny, because my stepmother was a teacher in one of those schools, and she wouldn't even follow the policies. She wouldn't enforce things. She would give the phones back to the kids, et cetera. So it was kind of funny. Like, when you can't even get your own wife to be on the same page of the discipline problem, imagine what's happening in the rest of the district.
All right. Let's give these guys a round of applause.